So for today, we're going to be finishing off chapter 12 here. I think this is 12. So we are going to get into our biological perspectives. This is going to be a lot of sort of repetition from our chapter on intelligence. But if we're looking at a biological perspective, this is mainly going to be delving into sort of that idea of underlying innate components that are influencing our patterns of behavior over time. So again, we're still trying to describe personality. And again, with all the different perspectives we've been doing, we had some of the earlier ones. So Freud was talking about patterns of behavior with his focus on the unconscious. Then we had our behaviorists focusing on external. Then we kind of leaned a little bit more cognitive and looked at internal but conscious processes. This is going to be internal but biological, meaning not really involving any of our thought processes, at least not until we start connecting to other ideas and other concepts. So here, when we're looking at our biological foundations for those external personality traits, we're trying to look at this interaction between nature and nurture, where nature is that biological component and nurture is the environmental influence, and the fact that both of them, as always, end up interacting. And of course, if we're trying to understand these biological components, we might try and sort of break it down into individual traits or into individual factors, something that we've talked about with intelligence before. And when we're starting to break down some of these, we can actually start looking at specific internal biological components, things like our nervous system and the functioning of our nervous system. We'll actually end up talking about some of our trait theories where we've broken personality into distinct traits. And when we start seeing patterns in, say, brain activation. So those are kind of interesting to look at. We can also talk about genetics and evolution. So are there specific genes that we know are involved? Or are we going to more say there's a broad idea of heritability, meaning that you have more likelihood of being similar to those who are related to you than those who are not related to you? And again, if we remember with intelligence, we start seeing things like you are more similar to an identical twin than to a fraternal twin. Those patterns are going to hold here as well. And we can talk about the evolutionary forces that might lead to certain types of traits that have genetic influences being beneficial in society. We can talk about all sorts of different things. Though, as per usual, we're trying to keep it high level, so I will refrain from going too much in depth if I can. Now, again, I've said we've talked factor analysis before as our sort of statistical approach, and we had said specifically with intelligence, factor analysis is not exclusive to intelligence. We just said that intelligence is something where we had tons and tons of questions that are all measuring a bunch of things that might be interrelated, and we can use factor analysis to boil that down to a bunch of independent factors that kind of describe individual separate components of intelligence. So we can see how that would apply here. We can measure a whole bunch of different things that might be related to a bunch of different aspects of personality, and we can use a statistical method to take tons of measures and boil them down into a smaller number of fairly independent features or factors, and those factors are what we're going to call traits within our different trait theories. And a lot of the differences between our trait theories are basically how many of these factors they want to consider. Do we want to look at a very small number of factors, or do we want to look at a whole bunch of factors? That's sort of up to the person designing each of these different sort of models. And none of them are going to necessarily be more or less correct than the others. We'll, of course, talk about pros and cons, what they're good at, and maybe what they're not so good at, but the base theory is still the same. So if you want the descriptor that goes with factor analysis, this may or may not actually be direct copy from what we did with intelligence, because it's exactly the same idea. But at the bottom here, we have a personality example of some of the things we might have broken this down into, where here they've identified a particular dimension of personality or a factor or a trait, whatever we're looking at. And here, this is that introversion-extroversion spectrum that I've mentioned a couple of times throughout the semester. So here they might have a bunch of questions that they could ask, and all of these questions seem to be interrelated. People who score high on question A also score high on B and C, so A, B, and C can all be grouped together and looked at in terms of introversion versus extroversion. And we can say that based on all of these scores, you are either high or low on this spectrum. So that's sort of how we're using this here. Now, for these different models, there are a couple of them that you'll see fairly commonly, but the big one in psychology is called the Big Five, or the five-factor model. So you've probably heard of this. This is talked about all the time, and a lot of the examples that I use actually come from this model. So that introversion, extroversion sort of spectrum, that is part of this, though similar descriptors actually fall into the other models as well, which actually tells us that it's something that is probably, say, biologically driven and possibly related because of that. So when we, again, see consistency, we get that inkling that there might be something biological happening, which matches what we're trying to capture here. So it does a great job. But what are some of the other factors? So if we break these down here, so I already said here we go, extroversion. So here they're only listing one end of our spectrum. So if you score high in extroversion, then you are extroverted. If you score low in extroversion, you would be introverted. And you can fall sort of anywhere along that spectrum. And this is a nice diagram because it also gives us things like what does it mean to be extroverted? You're a lot more sociable rather than likely to sort of retire and withdraw from social situations. Maybe you are more fun loving and outgoing. Here they're talking about sober as more of a calm and sort of not as boisterous in a social situation. Affectionate versus reserved, again, sort of an external expression versus more of an internal process. And this is why this exists on a spectrum of sort of outward seeking versus inward seeking. And we, again, can think of how this might relate to things like, say, your nervous system activation having an effect here. We also have neuroticism, which is another one that I've mentioned as examples before, where if you are high in neuroticism, you tend to express negative emotionality. So you might be more worried and insecure, more likely to, say, have self-pitying thoughts. These individuals tend to catastrophize and overreact in situations and are more likely to frame situations as negative versus those who would score low in this trait. So if you are low in neuroticism, usually this is a spectrum of neuroticism versus stability or emotional stability. But we would say that these individuals would be calm and secure and self-satisfied, so a lot more stable emotionally speaking. We then have openness to experience, and again, sort of easy to figure out. This is someone who is a little bit more open to experiencing new things. So you would be more imaginative. You would like a variety of experiences rather than staying stable in one thing. You're comfortable being independent. You'd rather take your own path, things like that. And then again, if you score low on this, maybe you're more likely to follow the lead of others. You're a little bit more down to earth and less sort of imaginative and free thinking. Maybe you have a preference for routine. So again, spectrums here. Agreeableness is looking at, are you soft-hearted, trusting, and helpful, or are you more ruthless, suspicious, and uncooperative? And then conscientiousness, are you, say, well organized and careful and self disciplined, or are you going to be more disorganized and careless, maybe less strong willed? Now, these are often framed as sort of positives versus negatives, which is something that's consistent across lots and lots of sources. However, I always like to stress that they aren't necessarily negatives. So we've sort of started with our neuroticism, being emotionally unstable or negative emotionality. That seems like a pretty bad thing. Scoring high in that means that you are going to overreact in situations. But if we want that evolutionary perspective, having somebody who is more likely to be worrying all the time, watching for potential threats, and easily worked up is somebody that's really, really hard to surprise and might be really good at helping protect a group. So in that situation, what's on paper framed as a negative thing is actually a positive in a group setting. And you can think of some of those sort of frameworks if we start looking at all of these. Even the introversion versus extroversion, having a mixture of people who are great at being social versus who are great at being on their own, that's awesome for division of labor in groups. Even openness to experience, having some adventurous people might help you find new things, but having some stable, safe, stay at home kind of people means you have that base stability to work from. So you can imagine all of the different possible frameworks. And if you get into sort of evolutionary theories and how they relate to some of these models, it's a really interesting read. Next, we have sort of a even smaller set of traits, and this is Eysenck's theory. So Eysenck was a German-born psychologist. He originally started with actually only two dimensions here, or two factors. So very, very small. We started with five from the five-factor model, then we get to Eysenck's two-factor theory, which is pretty extreme. But if we look at some of the traits, our first two dimensions, introverted versus extroverted, that comes back again. That's why I keep saying that that's something that probably has a strong biological component because it shows up consistently. We then also have stable versus unstable, which can connect to that neuroticism, which is sort of another one of those patterns that we tend to see repeated. And those, when we start looking at things like heritability coefficients, those two categories tend to be fairly high, especially in comparison to some of the others, which is again evidence of a biological component. Of course, as time has gone on, Eysenck ended up modifying this and adding a third trait. So if you were wondering, why have we listed three? That's because eventually psychoticism versus self-control was added, and it was tried to be framed as a little bit more, psychoticism versus self-control, trying to make it a little bit different from the neuroticism versus stability, in terms of this would be more of like impulsive behavior versus or impulsive behavior, being cold, being overly clinical, maybe antisocial, whereas neuroticism was more about sort of the internal mood state. So anxiety, being sort of worried all the time. So you can kind of think of it more as sort of internal stability versus more of an external action-based stability. Because I've always sort of looked at those two and said, aren't those awfully similar? And they are, but it's more about inside versus outside stability. And so these are our starting point. And of course, people would look at this model and say, all right, well, three dimensions is not sufficient to capture the diversity of human behavior. So of course, Eysenck had gone in and we have yet another one of our hierarchies in terms of theories, where any of those sort of smaller traits, which we can see around the edge here, those would end up being sort of our sub personality traits. So we can start with our larger, higher order continua or spectrums, and then we can end up with smaller sort of subsections that can be considered. So you get more depth if you want to dig into it. So all of these sort of higher level traits lead to those smaller, more basic traits. And the sort of three original ideas, these three categories here, were chosen because of that genetic influence. And that comes from that stability and consistency in a lot of our measures. So a lot of this was driven because Eysenck was convinced that there must be some large genetic influence, that humans must have some biological component that effectively just drives our behavior. And it was, again, one of those pushes to get away from some of the other theories at the time. So, especially things like, say, our behaviorist perspective, where the human internal biological component was irrelevant, or any of the other, say, cognitive or psychodynamic views, where we were focused only on thoughts or internal urges. This was all about that biology, which technically could tie to those internal urges. But and then if you just want a visual to go along with that, this would be that higher order trait of, say, introversion, extroversion. And then we'd have individual traits below that. And then you can use those to explain things like our patterns of behavior. So the habitual responses would be things like, under fairly similar conditions, you tend to react in these particular ways. But they still wanted to account for things like, when we had our theory saying that our specific situation can have a dramatic influence, and that's why we see inconsistencies in behavior. That was folded in through specific responses being something that would follow. So we have broad patterns under base conditions, but we can see modulation based on stuff going on in that moment. So kind of folding in a lot of our ideas here. Now, if we started at 5 and went down to 2/3, you can always, of course, go in the opposite direction. And this is where we have cattle. And cattle said, well, even 5 is not sufficient to capture the multidimensionality of human personality. I'm going to go with 16 distinctive personality factors. And each of these, once again, is a continuum. So you can be sort of anywhere between the two extremes. And if we look through these, there's 16 of them, so relaxed versus tense, reserved versus outgoing, less versus more intelligent. There's all sorts of stuff here. But if we look at some of these descriptors, we're going to find things that might actually relate to some of the stuff we've seen, say, in our 5-factor model. So timid versus venturesome, that might be related to our openness to experiences. Or if we have affected by feelings versus emotionally stable, that might lean a little bit neuroticism based. Self-sufficient and self-controlled, all sorts of stuff in here that we might find relate. So again, if we're thinking about how this is breaking down, all of these are trait models. We started with a ton of questions and we said, let's sort them into independent factors. And I hinted at the start that it's all about how many factors they want to consider. So if cattle said, I want more factors, you could break down what was a whole factor for one of the other models into multiple other components. So that's probably what's gone on here and why we can look at some of these and say, oh yeah, that might actually already fall under something else for a different model. And it's again, because different models are used in different purposes. So if we want sort of the generic, the 5-factor model is sort of the standard because it gives us a good broad overview. But if we went with, say, cattle's 16 factors, then we're getting a lot more fine-grained. And this might actually help us maybe be more accurate in some of our predictions of someone's behavior because now we have more points, more of these spectrums to look at, and that might actually help us better understand those fine-grained aspects of personality and the actions that follow. So different researchers will have different preferences depending on what exactly it is that they're looking at. So I kind of already got into this here, but our smaller number of factors, those models end up being good at predicting behaviors in more broad, big picture situations because we have less resolution. There's fewer factors to look at, fewer data points to consider. Whereas our higher number of factors for cattle would be more predictive ability in more specific situations, but it might not be as useful across broad situations. So you can take your pick on what you focus in on. Now, here's where we get into some of that. Remember this discussion from intelligence when we remember our twin studies. These were those studies looking at our different types of twins, identical versus fraternal, where they share differing amounts of their DNA. Well, our twin studies allow us to look at the fact that there might be more or less similarities between individuals based on how many genes they share. So if there is a genetic factor involved in our thing of interest, in our trait, then our identical twins that share all of their genes, 100% same genetics, then we'd see them have more similarities than their fraternal twin equivalents, because fraternal twins only share 50% of their genes. So sharing fewer genes means that you should have more variation in that trait. And so, of course, that is what we end up seeing. So this is our big 5 extroversion at the top this time, and our identical versus fraternal twins. We're seeing that for every single one of these, our identical twin bar, that yellow bar, is going to be higher than our orange bar. So we're saying that our identical twins are always more similar to each other in terms of their personality scores for this model than a fraternal twin would be. So you share more genes, you end up being more similar to that individual. And if you share fewer genes, you are less similar to that individual. I will note, though, at the bottom here, this is our correlation of scores. So we're saying that if twin A scores really high in extroversion, twin B is going to be fairly likely to also score high in extroversion. But even with identical twins, even with 100% shared genetics, our correlation coefficient is only about 0.5. So that's telling us that there's still a lot of variation there, even if you have identical genes. And when we look at our fraternal twins, that drops almost to the halfway point, which makes sense. They share only half as many genes, so that's nice and a good indicator of that genetic component. But it's still showing us that there's a lot of room for environmental components, whether it's things like shared environment. If we look at our adoption studies, raised together versus apart, but also that external environmental forces of, say, unshared environment, our error term, that can also play a role here too. So we know that there's way more going on than just genes, but this is evidence that there is some contribution of those genes. And we can see a little bit of variation here where things like extroversion, introversion are really high, and even openness to experience is fairly high, whereas agreeableness seems to be a little bit lower. So some of our personality traits will have a little bit lower of that genetic contribution according to their studies. So we were actually able to look at correlation coefficients because in this case, if we're looking at a score along a spectrum, we get a continuous number that we can compare against. I mentioned at the beginning, last time we talked about these, concordance rates are going to be interpreted similar, but they're actually specific to categorical variables. So if we were looking at something of, do you have a diagnosis, yes or no, that would fall under a concordance. But here we're just able to look at a correlation, and that's just fine. But if we wanted to look at similar diagrams here, this is just showing some other factors that might relate to some of those personality traits. So things like imagination or hostility, so some of these will tie in. We're seeing that we can have some of these fairly high in terms of correlation scores. This is between identical twins. And some of them, so things like social closeness, ends up being really low, which tells us that there's probably more of an external environmental influence than an internal biological influence. Now, of course, we're saying it's likely that there's more of that external force, but we're not saying that there is for sure this amount of an environmental influence, because from this, we're just saying that there's not a strong genetic influence. But we can't guarantee that it's specifically something like, say, a shared environment. That might be some of that error term too. So I'm not trying to make direct claims, we're just saying likelihoods. And then, of course, like I said, we have some of those physical components we can start looking at. So getting into the neuroscience or just specifically looking at our nervous system with that introversion, extroversion spectrum, we actually find that there is more brain activity in those who are introverts. And it seems really weird. The people that would like to stay home and avoid being out with others have too much activity, but if we frame it as their brains are overactive and therefore they seek environments with minimal stimulation to achieve sort of their optimal level of activation, that kind of makes sense. And in contrast, extroverts tend to have reduced amounts of nervous system activation, meaning that they might seek out more stimulating environments to raise those levels of activation and once again obtain a more optimal balance. So we can kind of frame this in terms of that idea of homeostasis, that internal balance. But here we can engage in specific actions that help bring us into balance to get us to that optimal level of stimulation. So if you have too much activation, you avoid extra stimulation to keep it lower. And if you have too little, then you seek out external activation to raise it up. And that's a really neat pattern that we've seen in a whole bunch of different studies and across long periods of time. So it's kind of cool to see that pattern show up. And again, it ties to one of the sort of spectra that I talked about that has lots of consistency across our models, and it tends to have very high correlation coefficients looking at our twin studies, So again, lots of evidence for a biological component and a nice, clean biological explanation that correlates with those scores. So it's all kind of nicely wrapped up. And of course, that's the example that we start with because we can show off that there is that possibility of finding a biological correlate, but that's not going to work in all situations. So everything else gets a little bit less clean cut. There are some studies that look at the stability instability spectrum where we'd say, yeah, there are some differences in our autonomic nervous system arousal. And this is almost looking at, say, reactivity, where individuals who are more stable are going to be less likely to have sort of extreme spikes, whereas those who are more overreactive or unstable, they're going to be more likely to have sort of sudden bursts in activation. So they might overreact to stimulation from their environment, and that might help allow us to explain some of those behaviors. But again, it's not as clean cut as some of the stuff with introversion, extroversion. And then with our novelty seeking, that would be that idea of, are you open to new experiences? Do you seek out those new situations? That might actually be another one of those external attempts at bringing certain levels back to normal balances, where it could be related to levels of dopamine. So dopamine is one of our neurotransmitters, one of the chemicals that works in the brain to activate a whole bunch of different areas, but it's most importantly noted to be related to our reward pathway. So when we encounter stimuli that make us feel good, it's often triggering a release of dopamine along that pathway. So for some people, maybe they have an underproduction of dopamine or an undersensitivity to dopamine. So they might seek out more external stimuli that might trigger the release of more of it in order to have more of those feelings that they're not getting on their own. So novel situations might be what they need to get that specific stimulation. And again, this gets a lot less certain as we get away from that introversion, extroversion. And so from all of this, sort of our interpretation starting to get into, hey, these neurotransmitters might be involved and these patterns of activation seem to be related, we're getting into that more neurological perspective where we're trying to look at these sort of internal physiological factors. And oftentimes we lean into things like hormones and neurotransmitters and the brain activity that they end up influencing. Because even though we don't get to go into too much, within our brains, we have all of our neurons, as we've mentioned before, and those neurons are activated or even slowed down by different neurotransmitters. So if we can understand either the neurotransmitters and how they're released or how they're withheld, or even the activation that follows after their release, that can give us an idea of those underlying processes. But as per usual, we don't always know the full pathways. We don't always know specifically this neurotransmitter released at this point when this particular stimulus shows up. Oftentimes, it's a very broad understanding because we're stuck looking for correlations. Basically, we have to find that this group of people scores high in extroversion, and they all tend to show this particular pattern. So we kind of need to get lucky on what might relate to that. And that's why things like extroversion and introversion and broad patterns of activation across the nervous system, that was a little bit easier to spot, but some of the others not so much. What are some of the other things that people have looked at? Testosterone is another one that comes up and will come up again in the next chapter. And this is a male sex hormone, though it is not just produced or released in males. This is also in females as well. And it's one of the things you can point to when we look at PMS. So when people get sort of aggressive and irritable, it can be fluctuations in this hormone too. But this hormone is related to dominance and aggression. It's even linked to things like persistence, so not backing down from a situation. It can also correlate with sensation seeking and high risk behaviors. So having too much of this hormone might lead to more sort of adventurous type behaviors. And you might even relate it to things like impulsivity or an inability to withhold responding. So there's some links there. Serotonin is another one of our neurotransmitters here. And it is usually an inhibitory neurotransmitter, though we find that a lot of the big neurotransmitters act a little differently depending on where we're looking. But low levels of serotonin is actually associated with a greater willingness to engage in those thrill-seeking activities. Basically, if we don't have enough of a neurotransmitter that inhibits or prevents activation, we can end up having too much activation. So maybe we have trouble inhibiting certain actions, so we can't hold ourselves back. So we're a little bit more impulsive. So those can be related. And what are some of the systems that might be involved with some of this? We have something called our reticular activating system, or here, ascending reticular activating system, because it typically starts looking at coming out of our hindbrain and our midbrain, so down towards where our brain joins our spinal cord, and it sends signals outward throughout the cortex. So as information comes in from our senses throughout our bodies, all of that information enters the spinal cord and heads up towards the brain. Even things like vision, our vision is actually going to come into the brain down towards where this hindbrain is, towards the bottom. So it's coming in and up through some of those structures. And we have a whole bunch of different specific parts of the brain that we don't care too much about here, all part of this system that help us filter out irrelevant stimuli. So if we're filtering a lot of stuff, there's not too much pulling our attention. Maybe we can focus on a small set of specific things. Whereas if this filter is maybe not removing certain stimuli, we might end up being over stimulated. So this is something that they tie to, say, that introversion extroversion spectrum, because if we're flagging a whole bunch of upcoming information as important, well, now we have too much that our brains are trying to make sense of. Whereas if this is overactive and it's filtering out everything, we have very few stimuli coming through. So we might have an under activation within the brain. This is also a system that's related to things like ADHD and other attention related disorders, because if everything is flagged as important, you might find it really hard to focus on the stuff that is actually important. All right, before I run off too much on that, I do want to keep moving on, and we can talk about our stability of our personality traits across time. And this is basically saying that, okay, if we have something that's biologically influenced, then our biology isn't changing over time. We have genes that sort of set stuff up, and we shouldn't see tons of change in our personality. Now, some of that is kind of true. So we do see some stability across sort of broad patterns of behavior, but there is still that room for environmental influences, and we do still see some change over time. Some of the ones that we have very strong biological or genetic links to, those tend to be more likely to stay stable. So things like introversion, extroversion, no surprises, emotionality and reactivity, overall activity level, those tend to stay pretty consistent. And again, it makes sense that you can tie those to sort of general activation or suppression within the nervous system. Yeah, that probably isn't changing a whole lot. But the ones that relate a lot more to things like internal cognitive processes or learning from experience, those can show a lot more potential to shift over time. So, say optimism versus pessimism. If you, say, encounter a whole bunch of really negative events, that can lead to more negative thought patterns, which would shift your score on this continuum. You could become more pessimistic over time due to experience that influences your internal thought patterns, that then changes those long-term behaviors, reactions to new situations. Or you can go the other way around. Maybe you've been speaking with a therapist and working on correcting negative thought patterns. You've done a lot of that cognitive therapy, and now you're more optimistic. You tend to frame things more positively, and that can then also have an influence on your behavior. So some of them are a little bit more fluid, and we just tie it back into some of the earlier discussions on those external environmental influences. I've already been hinting a little bit about those evolutionary theories or evolutionary components, where we can tell our stories about why certain types of personality traits might be beneficial in group settings. I do want to include one disclaimer here that is, when we're thinking about things from an evolutionary perspective, we need to keep in mind that natural selection is a very slow process, meaning that if we're trying to come up with stories that explain why it makes sense to be neurotic and having that be beneficial for a group setting, we're thinking about humans thousands and thousands of years ago. This is not something that current modern society would be influencing. It doesn't work that quickly. So we have to think in the scale of tens of thousands of years back in order to try and understand where some of these evolutionary forces would have had long term impacts on genes within our human genome. So that's that disclaimer of we're looking at sort of ancient human ancestors rather than modern society. So in this case, we might have traits that contribute to survival. So things like being paranoid might make you really good at spotting threats and keeping your group safe, or being sort of adventurous and adventure seeking, going out and experiencing new things might help you find new food sources or new places to live. And again, even being cautious might be beneficial because you're less likely to encounter threats. All of these are sort of evolutionary framings for different types of traits. And if we can frame a benefit for the two extremes of a particular personality spectrum, then that ends up telling us that, okay, well, it makes sense that there is variation along this trait. If it can be beneficial to be both high and low, then we'd have a selective pressure for that flexibility. And it might help explain why there is so much diversity within human sort of patterns of behavior, because having people who have different patterns and things that they enjoy doing and different tendencies gives you a lot more balance in a group setting. So, all sorts of ways to frame things. A couple of their examples here. So, conscientiousness. This would be the people who are then more likely to engage in health promoting behaviors and avoid risks. So, these people are a lot more sort of self aware and cautious. Again, great in a group setting, might keep your environment clean, organize things, throw out spoiled foods, make sure everybody is safe. Very useful for survival. Optimism. That optimism pessimism spectrum is an interesting one. And when we actually get into stress and health, optimism is one of the strongest predictors of sort of long term health benefits out of all of our different personality traits. So, people who are more pessimistic actually end up having sort of higher levels of stress. They are more likely to have cardiovascular symptoms. They are more likely to sort of die younger. So, optimism gives you that protective aspect. So, they tend to have fewer symptoms in the long run. Though, again, pessimism might have a way of being framed positively, might not be great for long term survival, but short term cautiousness and always expecting the worst might help you prepare for threatening situations. You'd never be caught unawares by a new threat. So you interact with a new group, and the optimists are all about forming friendships and relationships, and this is going to be great. But if you're pessimistic, you don't trust them. You're watching them all the time, so they can't sneak attack you. So we can frame both sides as useful. So again, a spectrum makes sense. What are some other ones that we might see with an evolutionary explanation? This is sort of different. We haven't talked about type A versus type B personalities. This is more of a sort of socially used term, but you might have heard of somebody having a type A personality. They tend to be a little bit more aggressive, people who really want things their own way. They'd rather take control of a situation. And it's usually used to describe people who say, go out and get degrees and become doctors or lawyers, somebody who's a little bit more cutthroat. And it can be framed as a positive thing because within society, that's sort of a high status thing. You are visible. Maybe you're a leader. Maybe you are someone who's well respected. You maybe make a lot of money. And if we, again, go sort of more ancient humans, we can get into things like leading a group, having more opportunities to engage with others, and controlling the behaviors of others that can be really beneficial in terms of your survival and reproduction options. But we also have those long term health problems because if you're putting yourself in these high stress situations and taking on extra work and trying to control everything, you are sort of worked up all the time and it can wear on your health. So long term, it tends to be detrimental, but short term can be beneficial. So that could explain why it still exists. But again, not everybody can be a leader. So it also makes sense to have more type B personalities who are a little bit more laid back and a lot less likely to sort of put themselves in harm's way. So they might have that long term benefit. So it tends to be a trade off among some of these traits. We've already said that even if we have sort of these predictors of personality and we can say somebody is likely to engage in these types of behaviors under these situations, a lot of the earlier theories from other days really didn't like the idea that human behavior is still really unpredictable. Things like current mood or even internal states like hunger can dramatically influence how you react to a situation. So that makes it really hard to predict what anyone is going to be doing in any moment. So we can't just look at your big five scores and say, oh, yeah, this is an extroverted individual and they are definitely going to want to go to this party. What else might be driving that behavior, though? They might say no, and what then explains that? So we need to consider the fact that traits interact with other traits. So there's all sorts of things going on. You might be extroverted, but maybe you're also pessimistic. And maybe you're worried about interacting with certain individuals in that situation. We also need to think about things like our internal evaluations of how we think of our particular trait identities. So, the importance of that trait and how consistent you are with it. Well, maybe you're sort of set on the idea that you are an introvert and you are really committed to that. And you really don't want to try and push to be more extroverted. You don't want to try and go to a party. That's no point in that. But somebody might be less committed to that. Maybe they're like, yeah, I'm usually introverted, but I feel like trying something new today. So I'm going to do something almost against my normal behavior. And that can tie into something called self monitoring because some individuals might pay attention to things like, oh, I usually say no to invites, and I don't want people to think that they should stop inviting me. So maybe I'm going to make a different decision for a more cognitive reason rather than a more sort of trait based biological reason. And we have people who are going to be more attentive to these types of cues. So if you are high in self monitoring, you are usually much more attentive to situational cues. So you might watch and say, okay, I've said no to the last 4 invites to go out with people for lunch, so I'm due to say yes at this point. Or I've noticed that people are getting frustrated that I've said no, so I'm going to adjust my behavior accordingly. If you are low in self monitoring, maybe you're a little bit more attentive to internal beliefs where you're sort of not so much watching what other people are doing or thinking. It's more of, I care what I want. And sometimes you can have people who are going to behave very differently in different situations. Basically, you can have extremes where somebody might not be committed to one side or the other. So, all sorts of things going on here. And a lot of this just ties back to the fact that human behavior has so many different factors that influence it. And we'll continue talking about that all semester. Even things like our social behaviors, people around us can influence our actions. We already talked about reactivity in previous chapters. All of that can be considered. So, looking at a particular personality trait score and thinking you can accurately predict behavior is kind of a futile perspective. We know there's way more to it than that, but it can give us an idea of broad tendencies. And as long as that's all we're trying to do, you can usually be all right. Now, we've done our evaluations of these different perspectives for each of the others. What are our pros and cons? Here, we're focusing on those biological factors. And sometimes we're trying to understand which biological factors, which specific mechanisms might be related. But we also have that data driven component with our factor analysis to pull out individual factors that might be related. That's very different from all of the other different types of theories that we've been looking at. So it's good to have that diversity in consideration. It also is one of the ones that has really good empirical support because this is a lot very much driven by the data. So the analysis components are just coming from a whole bunch of measurements, and that's really useful. especially where we started off with the psychodynamic perspectives that are almost impossible to quantify. So in this case, a strong benefit. Of course, limitations. That whole thing where, yeah, we're saying there's a biological component, there's a genetic component. Having more shared genes makes you more similar. Which genes? No idea. Which mechanism that might be influenced by those genes? In most cases, also still no idea. So there's a lot of vagueness. There's a lot of, we're not sure how this works. We just know that there's a predictable pattern. And as long as we're just trying to describe the pattern, that could be fine, but we'd love to be able to understand what's driving this behind the scenes. It's just something that we're still working on and is severely lacking at this point. We've already said it's very difficult to make specific predictions, so this is not where we go to try and understand how someone is going to act and why. It can just give us broad patterns and good estimates, but it's not going to be perfect as per usual. And then the last section, I wasn't sure if there was one more or not, but this gets into some of our different assessments. And from each of the different sort of models we've been talking about, you might imagine that there are all sorts of different kinds of assessments that could exist. There's all sorts of personality tests. We're probably most familiar with the ones where you say log into a website and they give you a whole bunch of questions and there's that sort of 4-point scale and you have to agree or disagree with statements. That's one method of getting a personality assessment. So that's maybe one of our scales that involves some self-rating, but we also have other things to consider. Things like responses on projective tests. That's something like, what would you do in these situations? So looking at actions rather than just agreeing or disagreeing with statements. We can look at those physiological measures, activation in the nervous system or activation in specific parts of the brain, or even levels of hormones might be relevant. Behavioral assessments, we can look at what people do and how they act. We can also have ratings by other people. So if we don't trust self-reports, maybe we can have somebody else make an evaluation. Interview a child's parents and teachers to get a feel for how they tend to act. We can have interviews and get people to answer questions and boil those down into data points, all sorts of different things. And again, this is just meant to be a sort of a summary of some of the options, but this is going to relate to a lot of the stuff we've talked about back in chapter 2 in terms of psychological measurement techniques. We, of course, are going to be concerned about a couple of things when asking these questions. So reliability is one thing that might be important. Reliability is all about consistency of our measurements. So we would really like to see some kind of consistency, some kind of pattern when we're looking at these tests. Personality is supposed to be, at least from our definition, something that's relatively stable across time. So if the personality scores are supposed to be stable, we would actually like the tests to output some kind of stable result. And what kinds of reliability might we check? One is called test-retest reliability. That's basically saying if the same person takes the same test every 6 months for 10 years, we should see those scores tend to be pretty stable. They should be consistent. That would be high test-retest reliability. Whereas maybe somebody designed a test fairly poorly. Maybe it is not valid in terms of the design. And instead of trying to test personality, maybe there's a bunch of questions that are influenced by current emotional state. Your current mood influences the score. Well, that would lead to inconsistency across time. So we don't have that reliability. Now there's a problem. We might have to look into what's going on to make that inconsistent. If we're looking at something like interpreting interviews or even sort of free-form survey type questions, we might have to look at inter-judge reliability. And this is when we're considering, is everybody who's delivering this test interpreting the responses the same way? And you would usually test this by having two people, say, watch the same interview and both score that person's responses. And in these cases, you usually have a strict checklist of what it is you're looking for, what counts for one score or another. And in that case, if you have high inter-judge reliability, they are employing the same test consistently. So again, we still care about that consistency, but now it's about how people apply it. And this is really important because if we have something fairly subjective, like an interview, if we had, say, one therapist is interpreting it one way and a different therapist in a different practice interprets those questions a different way, now there isn't agreement between the two, and any results that we'd get from that, anything we try and look at in terms of personality scores, has inconsistency. I've also kind of hinted at validity, but for us here, validity is really specifically looking at construct validity. So the way that we have turned our more abstract idea of personality or a specific personality trait into something measurable, but we would like an accurate measure and a measure that actually relates back to the concept that we're trying to describe. So we would look at this in terms of the degree to which you are actually measuring what you think you are measuring. If your personality test is actually a measure of personality, then you have high validity. But if it's measuring more your current mood than your long-term stable personality, then you have low validity. So you need a test that is both reliable and valid in order to make any kind of interpretation of the data that you get from it. If you don't, then maybe you're not capturing a personality, or maybe there's too much variation in the data and you can't really make any sense of it. Both of these are very important. Some of our sort of descriptors of interviews, the standardized questions, the fact that there's interpretation involved in taking those sort of free-form answers, we do have some drawbacks to that. It's still a self-report thing, so that's usually problematic, though you can have others be interviewed, but you're still left with, we're relying on people's ability to recall and somebody else's ability to score those abstract responses. So there's a lot of concerns there. We can use our behavioral assessments, which again we've done recently, but we need some way of determining which counts as which behavior. So if we were looking at smiling, how much of a change in facial expression is required? If we're looking at somebody showing kindness, what kinds of actions would qualify? We don't just want to describe the behavior, we'd also like to sort of make some accurate measure of it. Remote behavior sampling is something we may or may not have discussed before, but this is looking at behavior, but indirectly. So you can sample their behavior at something like maybe random times. So if you have an app that's going to turn on every 3 days and it's going to record for 10 minutes, and we're going to look at what people are talking about across time. That would be an example of a remote behavior sampling. And this is a neat way where if you have people out and living their lives and doing things where samples are collected sort of across time, you might get a better cross section of the actions they engage in. Also, if you're not sitting there as a researcher with like a clipboard or a video camera on their faces, you're a lot more likely to get more natural behaviors because that reactivity is a lot lessened, especially if this is something that goes on for a long time and they're able to settle back into normal behavioral patterns. That's pretty straightforward. Of course, if we've been talking about our trait theories, those are often strongly associated with our personality scales. So these tend to be objective measures, and we're trying to sort of capture sort of a specific type of trait. So we ask targeted questions to try and capture sort of something that we can tie to one of our specific factors or traits. And oftentimes we use standardized questions, and there is some kind of standardized scoring key where everybody that takes this test has only a set number of responses, and we collapse those set number of responses into a particular calculation that gives us a certain output. So we're going to be getting more standardized outputs, and there's a lot less likely for variation in how this is employed. It's really useful because we can collect tons of data and we don't have to worry about things like interjudge reliability. But of course, we still have the issue of people are answering questions about their own opinions. Are they being truthful? So the same things where if we just have surveys, you can have those issues too. We need to be able to detect those patterns in responses if they're using response sets. That's really important as well, all the standard stuff. We can also maybe point out one more disadvantage could be if you're trying to design a new test, you have to go through a lot of hoops to make sure that any new kinds of measures or new questions being added actually do what they're supposed to do. So you have to have your own analysis of reliability and validity before it could become accepted. And that's, again, one of those reasons why once we have a standard like the Big Five and the questions that go with it, those tend to be kept consistent and everybody uses it. It's a lot easier than designing your own questions. And of course, there are a whole bunch of standard personality tests that are often seen. Just really quickly, we can have sort of a rational versus empirical approach. And this is going to sound an awful lot like when we were looking at intelligence and talking about data-based versus theory-based approaches. But here, a rational approach is going to start with our idea or our conception of what a trait is, and then ask questions that seem relevant to that trait. So the NEOPI is actually one of our examples where they started with, we think these traits capture all the dimensions of human personality, and here are the questions we've designed to ask about those different dimensions. We could instead have a more empirical approach, which is going to be a little bit more data-driven. But here we're going to be basing our grouping on responses to different questions and having patterns in those responses. So in those cases, we have our Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which is a mouthful, but you might have heard of the MMPI. So that's the acronym they use for it, and that's been updated consistently, and that one's fairly commonly encountered. We also have a couple of other weird ones. So under some of our assessments, we have projective tests. Now, these, you can tell right off the bat, these are going to fall under those psychodynamic evaluations, because in this case, we're going to present people with ambiguous stimuli and ask them to interpret those stimuli. And then we have to interpret their responses to find some deeper meaning to it. So again, it just echoes of psychodynamic approaches. But the two big ones here are going to be our Rorschach ink blots. So I'm going to show you an abstract image. What do you see? You might look at this and see a bunch of different flowers. And maybe we're going to interpret that. So you're seeing sort of growth and things that are happy and positive. So maybe you're in a good mindset. So of course, there's all sorts of rules on interpreting your responses, but your responses are also based on an ambiguous stimulus. So you can definitely see why this could be problematic. How the heck do you quantify somebody's responses to something abstract? And how do you make sure that everybody is interpreting those responses the same way? It's really, really hard. So that's a big critique here. We also have something called the thematic apperception test, but they will show you, again, ambiguous images, and they will ask you what is happening in this image. So you'd look at this, and I'd ask you to tell me a story about what's happening here. So we have this one person in the front who's maybe oblivious to this sort of creepy looking image in the background, and maybe someone is sneaking up on someone. But that kind of a maybe pessimistic interpretation might be indicative of a negative internal state. Whereas if we were talking about somebody who they just had a conversation and they sort of are leaving what was an amusing discussion, that might be a more positive approach. And again, very abstract, very hard to quantify, and not everybody loves these types of tests. And if we wanted that sort of sorting, which of our different perspectives leans toward which of those tests? Of course, psychodynamic is those projective techniques. Humanistic approaches, they like a lot of self-report measures, not always the same standardized approaches though. So these might be a little bit more open form, but it depends on which study you're looking at. More social cognitive stuff is going to lean a little bit more into those behavioral assessments, as of course would more of a behaviorist approach. The biological side of things, we can get into physiological measurements, but our biological components tie into how our trait theories develop, so that might be a link we want to keep in mind. And once we have our specific categories from our trait theories, oftentimes we'll use those standardized inventories, our standardized personality tests, as ways of quantifying our scores for those tests.